But it does not seem that I can trust anyone, said Frodo. Sam looked at him unhappily. It all depends on what you want, put in Merry. You can trust us to stick to you through thick and thin, to the bitter end, and you can trust us to keep any secret of yours closer than you keep it yourself. But you cannot trust us to let you face trouble alone and go off without a word. We're your friends, Frodo. Anyway, there it is. We know most of what Gandalf has told you. We know a good deal about the ring. We are horribly afraid, but we are coming with you. And with that, we've come to a series that we've been looking forward to for almost a year now, The Life and Writings of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Well, actually, Cole, it took about a year to read all the books you assigned for research for this, but it was delightful. I know a lot more about Tolkien and I have a greater appreciation even than I did before.
We did C.S. Lewis earlier this year, and that was a real joy. We had Ben Williams with us on that one, and it was so delightful to do the reading for that. But I couldn't help but think as we were doing the Lewis series, I really can't wait to do Tolkien.
Exactly.
So, what we're going to do in this series is we're going to go through the life and writings of Tolkien, but we're going to do it a little differently than we did in the Lewis series. There, we followed his life pretty chronologically, and then we did some of the writings at the end. What strikes me about Tolkien as opposed to Lewis is Lewis was a bit more multifaceted than Tolkien in the sense that he was writing fiction, he was writing apologetics, he was writing sci-fi. Tolkien wrote a lot of things, much beyond just the two that he's known for, but
Hmm.
he put himself into those two things in such a way that you can actually talk about Tolkien by talking about The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and you can talk about The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit by talking about Tolkien. And so we're going to take some of these threads that run through the life of J.R.R. Tolkien and through The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and use those to better understand Tolkien and his works. And so in this one, as you've seen on the title, we're going to talk about the fellowship, a word that for church people has a lot of meaning in the Bible.
Right.
For Lord of the Rings people, it has a lot of meaning in the books. But what we're going to find out, it had a very personal meaning for J.R.R. Tolkien.
Exactly. One of the things about Tolkien, and I've read a lot of fantasy, Tolkien's is different. I mean, it's just on a little bit different level. I think history has demonstrated that. But one of the things about Lewis and Tolkien, Cole, is they both were shaped very heavily by their early lives in different ways, but they were shaped very, very much by their early lives. And then they flowered into their various interests. And then their work ultimately comes out of their interests. For example, Tolkien, fantasy worlds, linguistics, languages, poetry, etc. But it gets shaped very early on. Tolkien didn't have a very good start in life. He was born in South Africa because his father was a branch manager there. And by 1896, his father died, and his mother had already taken he and his brother back to England. But they basically became, single parent family very early on. And I think a lot of what their mother Mabel did with them, to me, began to shape the Tolkien that we know as an adult.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think throughout this series, we'll be comparing and contrasting Tolkien and Lewis, who end up becoming very good friends. They have a lot of similarities in their early life. One of the differences emerges immediately, and that is that early in his life, Lewis's mother dies, and that's something that he never recovers from in some ways.
Right.
Early in life for Tolkien, his father dies, and his mother is raising him and his brother, Hilary, by herself. And that actually shapes the rest of his life. So whereas
Hmm.
uh, Lewis has a troubled relationship with his father, Tolkien has an extremely formative relationship through his mother. In fact, when they come back to England and they begin this new life, that becomes, in some ways, a golden era for Tolkien.
Right.
His mother, Mabel, decides to homeschool the boys. And in the book, The Fellowship by the Zaleskis, that we talked about some in the Lewis series about the Inklings, he says Mabel Tolkien set in motion her son's madly spinning top of a mind, from which epic poems, children's stories, fantasy novels, invented languages, literary essays, philological studies, songs, watercolors, and pen and ink sketches would take flight for the next 80 years. Mabel was really a remarkable woman. She was very well educated herself. She knew and read several different languages. She was
Hmm.
an artist, both sketching and painting, and that was something that came out in J.R.R. Tolkien's life. And she decided in this little cottage that they had outside of Birmingham to educate these boys as best she could, in kind of what we would consider now a classical Christian education. And what's interesting is she becomes a Catholic during this period,
Right.
and her family and her in-laws are Baptists and Unitarians. And I didn't know the Baptists and Unitarians could agree on anything other than they did not like it that she had become a
Didn't like,
Catholic.
right.
So that isolates them a little bit. It's really just the three of them. And she wins a place for them at one of the best schools in England, King Edward's School in Birmingham. They start there in 1900. And there's a movie that was made based on John Garth's book, Tolkien and the Great War, just called Tolkien.
Hmm.
And I would say go watch that movie. If you love J.R.R.
Right.
Tolkien, or if you don't, go watch that movie. It's fantastic. We'll refer to it several times in this series just because they do such a great job portraying Tolkien's early life. However, in that movie, they get the timeline wrong on this. The basic timeline they trace is the boys come back to England. Their mother is educating them. She dies, which does happen. And
Hmm.
then they go to King Edward's school. But what
Right.
actually happens is she's the one that helps them get into King Edward's school. And so they start going there in 1900. She becomes Catholic, so she pulls them out and sends them to a Catholic school for a little bit. But John Ronald, which is what J.R.R. Tolkien was known as a kid, ends up going back to King Edward's school in 1903. It was shortly after that, in November of 1904, that after being sick with diabetes, his mother dies. And Tolkien
Hmm.
always looked back at this as kind of a tragedy in his life because not just the tragedy of her dying, but because 15 years later, when insulin is being developed, she could have
Right.
been saved.
She could have been saved. Yeah.
And you just like you see Lewis writing out his own grief with his mother in the Chronicles of Narnia, certain scenes of the Chronicles of Narnia. I do think there are themes in the Lord of the Rings. Healing is one of the very strong themes in Lord of the Rings. One of the things you
Hmm.
notice if you go from watching the movies to reading the book is how many times in the book the characters are repeating this refrain from the very beginning when Frodo gets stabbed by the Nazgul to the very end when Aragorn becomes king. They repeat this
Hmm.
refrain: "The hands of the king are the hands of a healer." And this has a spiritual dimension for Tolkien. The Savior, Jesus Christ, is a healer. But I think he's also writing out this grief of his mother's death that could have been prevented by technology that was just a little bit away. And if they'd had the right medicine, she wouldn't have died. But he felt a little bit of guilt over his mother's death because he saw how much she worked and sacrificed to raise them. And I think this is one
Hmm.
of the things that propels him in school. He does very well at King Edward's School. He does very well at Oxford. He does very well as a teacher. He always has this drive to learn, to be proficient. And she certainly gave him a great foundation for learning. After she dies, one of the most touching things in his life, and they portray this really well in the movie, happens. There's this priest whose name is Father Francis Xavier Morgan, who comes
Hmm.
into their life and essentially takes the boys under his care. Now, he had known their family before Mabel dies, and when she did die, he was like a father figure for these boys. And he watches over their finances. He makes sure that he can find them a place to live. He makes sure that they're doing well in school. He ends up forbidding Tolkien from seeing his one true love, Edith, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. But he
Uh-huh.
becomes a father figure, an adoptive father figure for both of these boys, and he finds them a place to live as boarders. And it's the second one of these places where he meets a young woman named Edith Bratt.
Yes, Edith is also an orphan, and she is making money by being a seamstress and living at this house. And he, needless to say, is very infatuated with her. And it's not just a childhood romance because this will last the rest of his life. There's certainly an element of two orphans finding each other in the world and kind of an us against the world type thing. But as you said, he is forbidden from pursuing that. And I can understand Father Morgan's thinking is, focus on school, do well there, because he's made it back into King Edward's School, which is a very good school, but you have to perform very well. In fact, in King Edward's School, he got a very classical education, and I mean a very classical education. They not only learned to translate Latin and Greek, they learned to do composition in Latin and Greek, which is another whole other level of learning a language. That really wasn't unusual for the times, but it's very unusual now. And they were able to debate in Latin. They performed Aristophanes' plays each year in Greek. And so obviously it took a lot of time to study, and Father Morgan knew what a young romance could do to that. So I'm a little sympathetic to him, although as you read about his life, he understood it as keeping me from my true love. In any case, he did thrive at King Edward's and really caught fire, his love of classics and languages.
You can almost see the seed starting to bloom in his life when he's at King Edward's. Of course, like you described, he's getting this great classical education. His mother had taught him some Latin and French before he goes to school, but it wasn't until he learns Greek that he starts to realize his love for language. And if you have learned languages before, what's interesting about this is you can sympathize with Tolkien. Not all languages are created equal, and certain
Right.
people really gravitate to certain languages over others. At the time, it was expected that every one of these kids would know Latin and Greek, probably German, some French, but Latin and Greek, as similar as they are compared to something like Hebrew that you learn in seminary, are very different languages. And
Right.
what happens is Tolkien really loves Greek. In fact, that's the first time where he tries to invent a language that
Hmm.
captures what he calls the Greekness of Greek. After encountering that at age 10, he begins to investigate other languages. Old English, starts reading Chaucer, studying Old and Middle English. He's drawing, he's excelling in German at the school. He ends up winning the school prize in 1910. And around this time, as he's about a high schooler, he encounters the ancient Gothic language, which is an older Germanic tongue. And this is where his imagination really begins to take off. Because what he's going to do later in life in The Lord of the Rings is he's going to write a book that comes after creating all these languages. So one of the things that differentiates Tolkien from other sci-fi writers or fantasy writers who are trying to portray other worlds is Tolkien had the languages and the places and the maps already, and then he needed a story. Most people write
Right.
a story and then you furnish them with languages and maps and all of
It's
that.
a
But
good point.
this is just the way that his mind worked. He creates a language that's kind of based on the ancient language of the Geats. So think of Beowulf. What language would they have spoken? Of course, he will become one of the great Beowulf scholars. He'll write probably the most influential essay on Beowulf of the 20th century later in his life. So he's fascinated with these ancient cultures and languages. And what's interesting is at King Edward's School at the time, this put him in a relatively cool crowd. Okay, so if
Right.
you're a junior high kid and you're creating, ancient Geat languages today, you are not in the cool crowd. That's almost
Right.
guaranteed. You will not be one of the cool kids. But one of the unique features of this time period is he becomes friends when he's at King Edward's with really smart, normal, very popular boys. He's not like Lewis, who was an outcast at school. He's one of the guys, and they play rugby
Right.
together. They're winning the school prizes together. They're doing pranks and all the things that you would think of kids at a boarding school doing. And when he leaves King Edward's School, he has an incredible education under his belt. But probably more importantly for the rest of his life, he has a set of really wonderful friends as well.
Right. That's particularly important because he's an orphan, but it really does set the stage for this theme of fellowship that runs through his life and of course figures heavily, very heavily in his writings. The what I thought was interesting, Cole, is this starts out with these young men. I'll let you explain. He basically had three really close friends. Some others came and went, but three were in the middle. But they started out and they had a tea club. And they would basically go in the library and they would brew teas and they would have conversations. And obviously they're all studying Latin and Greek and German and then they move off in their own ways, poetry, literature, whatever. And so they have these conversations and they get this camaraderie going. Then they decide that they'll form the Barovian Society, which that kind of a thing was very common. And they basically went to a tea room and would have those official club meetings. And so the Tea Club and Barovian Society became the TCBS. And if you've ever read anything about his life, you'll see that acronym. And it basically is this small knit club of like-minded young men like himself.
Yeah, the TCBS is interesting. It is the triumph of the imagination. You have
Hmm.
these preteen, teenage boys who are fascinated by what they're reading and writing and doing art. And what I love about this, there's many boys that are in this group, but there really is a core four that are in the group. And
Hmm.
so Christopher Wiseman, son of a Methodist minister, raised on Handel by his father. You could just see his father imprinting on him the love of high and refined artistic tastes. He becomes a musician, and he is someone who composes symphonies and things as a high
Hmm.
school kid. Robert Gilson, who's actually the son of the headmaster of King Edward School at this time, he's a rugby player, but he's passionate about the arts as well. John Garth writes, his chief delight was in the sculptures of the Florentine Renaissance, and he could expound with warmth on Clarity and Brunelleschi and Ghiberti and Donatello. Like John Ronald, Rob is often busy drawing or painting. His avowed object is to record the truth, not merely to satisfy aesthetic appetite. You get a little taste of what these conversations and things were about. The last one, Jeffrey Smith, was a latecomer to the TCBS, but considered himself a poet. And touchingly, Tolkien will publish a series of his poems after World War One in his honor. So
Hmm.
you've got these boys who are they're idealistic in the right kind of way. They really do believe that they're going to change the world through their art. They are, maybe we would call it naive. They're naive enough to think that a poem written by a 14-year-old and discussed at the TCBS might be something that changes the world,
Right.
or a little composition or a painting might be the thing that actually captures beauty in a way that nobody has captured it before. And I think these boys were very adventurous in their sense of their own destiny, and in
Hmm.
the sense of what they were doing. And I think probably most people can think of a time in their life when maybe you look back at it now and you think, oh, I didn't even know what was out there. I didn't even know what was possible. But you were wrapped up around some idea or some experience, and you thought that you really could be
Hmm.
discovering this for the first time. You really could be the person who had captured this in a way nobody ever had. That's what these boys are doing. And it's a tribute to the environment that they're in, and it's a tribute to each of them that they were able to engage in this kind of creative process together. And it's going to be something that Tolkien goes looking for the rest of his life.
That's really true. And skipping ahead a little, because the TCBS group will not survive intact through World War One. But skipping ahead for just a moment, you do see Tolkien recreating this experience later in his life. Probably the most famous club he was a part of or started was the Inklings. And this was later in his life, in the middle of the 20th century, so well into World War II and beyond. But this is, again, a group of intellectuals. And by that, I don't mean elites. I just mean people that are widely read and are serious. In other words, I would consider those teenage boys intellectuals in the sense that they'd read widely, they knew quite a bit, they had intelligent discussions. He's going to do this again later with probably the most famous club uh, called the Inklings.
Yeah, John Garth does a great job talking about this because he's sharing a lot of the things that they are working on together at this time. So we still
Hmm.
have the poems and stories that they were writing. We have notes on some of the conversations that they were having. And when you read these, you can see in germ form some of the things that are going to pop up in Tolkien's life later. You can see some of the themes that he's really in love with that are going to come
Right.
into his life later. And of course, as we talked about with C.S. Lewis, the Inklings become not just prominent in their own sense, they become
Hmm.
prominent worldwide. I mean, people there are Inkling clubs all over the world now because of what
Right.
Tolkien and Lewis and Barfield and Williams because of what they were doing. But Tolkien was doing this even when they weren't accomplished and when they hadn't written anything major. This was something core to his personality. And that's why I like to think about Tolkien in terms of his writings because The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit to a lesser extent are about this very thing. Now, it's not about a group of intellectuals, it's about a group of people who are on a quest for something. The Fellowship of the Ring. These
Right.
nine who are on the quest to destroy the ring. But the Lord of the Rings is Tolkien said that Lord of the Rings is primarily about death, which is what we'll talk about in the next episode, the reflection on
Hmm.
World War One.
Right.
But a sub theme of that, and what makes death so central in The Lord of the Rings and in Tolkien's life, is death against the backdrop of friendship, death against the
Right.
backdrop of fellowship. And that life is really the sum of these core relationships that Tolkien has. You know, Tolkien doesn't have a family, really. He
Right.
just has the TCBS. And of course, he gets married and has a family of his own, but he has the Inklings. This is his extended family. These are the closest relationships in his life. And the Lord of the Rings revolves around this same theme. When you start out in the Shire, you find yourself in a community of people that have very close relationships. And you
Hmm.
find Frodo, who's been taken in by his uncle, who has, an extended family just like Tolkien did,
Hmm.
of these other hobbits. And as the story progresses, one of the major tributaries that runs through it is creating these new friendships. So I
Right.
was just thinking about two of these. The most people will know whether you've read the books or seen the movies. Sam and Frodo are probably the showcase friendship of the Lord of the Rings. And that's the one that's talked about the most. It is an ideal kind of male friendship. And it's interesting to note that at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, Frodo and Sam are not really friends. In the movie,
Right.
they seem more like friends than they do in the book, but you've got to remember that uh, Frodo and Sam are from different socioeconomic groups.
Right.
Sam is Frodo's gardener. So they might be friendly with each other, but they're not peers. They're not friends. Sam works for him. And that actually kind of reminds me of the C.S. Lewis podcast when he gets the offer to move to Cambridge and he turns it down because he doesn't want to leave his gardener. That's
That's right.
that's kind of
Yeah.
what we're talking about here. They're friendly. They obviously respect each other, but it's not as though they are one to one. Sam is lower than Frodo, but throughout the books, or throughout the book, as they go on this quest together, and as Sam proves his character, he ends up being the one who saves Frodo and guarantees that they will complete
Right.
their mission. And I love the touching scene when the fellowship breaks and Frodo decides to go out on his own and he decides to cross the river and go off
Right.
into Mordor by himself. And Sam comes running after him and trudges into the water trying to catch the boat. And Frodo's looking back at him. You can't swim. What are you doing? You can't swim. And he's coming for the boat and he's about to drown. And Frodo pulls him back into the boat. And in the movie, they tweak this a little bit and he says, "I'm going alone, Sam." And Sam says, "I know you are, and I'm coming with you."
Exactly.
That's where
That's a
their
great
friendship really
line.
begins
Uh-huh.
to take off. And of course, they're together throughout the rest of the book. The other one I thought of is Legolas and Gimli. So these
Hmm.
two, Legolas being an elf, Gimli being a dwarf, are kind of like oil and water in
Right.
the world of the Lord of the Rings. There are some historical injustices that have taken place that have put elves and dwarves on the wrong side of each other. and they don't like each other. And in fact, they're
Right.
really only there to make sure the other group doesn't attain some kind of power or riches or influence that they don't have. I mean, they
Right.
really don't like each other at the beginning. But over the course of the book, what happens is by working together, by pursuing Merry and Pippin together, by becoming friends with them, they become friends with each other. And by the end, they have become the best of friends with each other, willing to lay their lives down for each other. So I've just been thinking about this theme in The Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit, the friendship, the fellowship of the ring, of the nine, but also of the individual characters strikes me as a natural outworking of one of the main themes of Tolkien's life. What do you think on that?
I completely agree with you. And I'm going to make an editorial comment here. I think in the new series on The Lord of the Ring, they've taken this idea, particularly Legolas and Gimli, two different kinds of people, and they've fashioned it to fit the narrative of the 21st century. Is can't we all live together? We're all the same under the skin, mutual respect, everybody's the same kind of an idea. I don't think that's where this is intended to go. It's a very personal relationship between those two. What I think it speaks to us today, both men and women, but particularly men. This is something you and I see in the church is that men really lack deep male friendships. Women, not so much with other women, but men in particular. What I see coming out of this is the idea that you can have deep male friendships. If I were going to take a lesson, it wouldn't be the lesson of peace and harmony in the world. It would be the lesson of valuing these deep friendships that you can have with other men. So that's just my editorial comment. I do think it comes from the way Tolkien was shaped, but I think the lesson for us has more to do with we can also have that versus some kind of sociological lesson to be read out of it.
Yeah, I want to read another passage from The Lord of the Rings that really hits this theme as you've been describing it. I think we'll have plenty of time to talk about the Rings of Power throughout this series. I think season two was definitely better than season one, in my opinion. It was more action and
Hmm.
all that. But what's wrong with it, unfortunately, is the writers don't understand the worldview of J.R.R. Tolkien that comes through in the books. His Silmarillion all the way to the Lord of the Rings, wherever you read him, it is built on his own understanding of the Christian world. And we'll get
Hmm.
into the difference between what Lewis is doing in the Chronicles of Narnia and what Tolkien is doing in The Lord of the Rings. Neither one
Right.
are allegory, where you have each character represent something in history. Neither one are really trying to be an overt retelling of the gospel story, but
Hmm.
both of them have this mythic quality in that they take the best of what they see in humanity, goodness, truth, and beauty, friendship, all these great themes, and they infuse that into the story to magnify it on a grand scale.
Right.
And so what you're seeing is his worldview writ large without being real preachy. So it's
Hmm.
not as overt as a lot of the entertainment that we consume today. It's actually just deeply shaped and informed by the moral universe as J.R.R. Tolkien saw it, which would be as
Right.
a mid 20th century Catholic. Um, the shows, they have the worldview of the early 21st century secular media.
Right.
Like you said, everybody's got to look different. You got to have Harfoots of every tribe, tongue, and race, and
Right.
they've got to all get along. As opposed to Tolkien's view, which was you have these distinct people groups that are modeled in some ways after people groups of history who
Hmm.
bring their own value and insight to the table and help each other. In their differences, they come together and help each other. There's a passage here I think that kind of captures this. This is in The Ring Goes South. So after they come to Rivendell, the hobbits come to Rivendell, they've had this meeting convened, which is called the Council of Elrond, which for my money is the best chapter in all of the Lord of the Rings, probably is the Council
Hmm.
of Elrond for the intrigue. There's some chapters at the end that are just the best for action. But you
Right.
get the whole history of the ring told around this circle of kind of power players who have come to Rivendell. And once they decide that they're going to take the ring and destroy it, they are trying to appoint the group that's going to go. And this highlights what they do and why they do it highlights this theme of friendship among people that are very different. So the company of the ring, Elrond says, shall be nine, and the nine walkers shall be set against the nine riders that are evil. With you and your faithful servant Gandalf will go, for this shall be his great task and maybe the end of his labors. For the rest, they shall represent the other free peoples of the world, elves, dwarves, and men. Legolas shall be for the elves, and Gimli, son of Gloin, for the dwarves. They are willing to go at least to the passes of the mountains, and maybe beyond. Turns out they go far beyond the
Far beyond.
mountain passes. For men, you shall have Aragorn, son of Arathorn, for the ring of Isildur concerns him closely. There remain two more to be found, said Elrond. These I will consider. Of my household I may find some that it seems good to me to send. But that will leave no place for us, cried Pippin in dismay. We don't want to be left behind. We want to go with Frodo. That is because you do not understand and cannot imagine what lies ahead, said Elrond. But neither does Frodo, said Gandalf, unexpectedly supporting Pippin. Nor do any of us see clearly. It is true that if these hobbits understood the danger, they would not dare to go. But they would still wish to go, or wish that they dared, and be shamed and unhappy. I think, Elrond, that in this matter it would be well to trust rather to their friendship than to great wisdom.
That is a brilliant line. I mean, we all remember that scene if we've read the book. And uh, what a thing to say is to trust to their friendship more than their wisdom, which, by the way, I think is what makes Frodo and Sam Gamgee so close. Is Sam Gamgee is not the sharpest tool in the shed, but his loyalty is unquestioned and his courage is unquestioned. And it really does. We live in a culture, you and I've talked about this before, of experts. And we like to say, well, you get your answers from experts. But what Gandalf is saying, and what is true sometimes, is experts are very useful, but loyalty and close friendship are how things are actually attained sometimes. And perhaps we've lost that. And that's why I think that The Lord of the Rings is an enduring story. In fact, it's more popular now than when he wrote it. And I
Mhm.
think that may be one of the reasons.
I do think that's true, and I think it's a lesson for us to take is what they're going to need on this quest is not their individual expertise, although that's going to come in
Hmm.
handy. What they're going to need is each other on
Right.
this quest. And what's interesting about that is just about, 100 pages or so after this passage that we just read, where they set off from Rivendell, they are fractured and the
Right.
fellowship splits and they never actually return all together again. In fact, well, eight of them will return together at the very end of the book, but they never return like they did when they set off from Rivendell. And I remember, I think the movies are so well done. I think it's one of those rare
Hmm.
series where the movies are almost as good as the books. They're not quite as
Right.
good, and they, of course, have to leave some things out, but they're almost as good. And it's because of the brilliance of the people that they got. Peter Jackson, recruiting just brilliant people all over this. But I listened to somebody talk about this one time. The soundtrack in The Lord of the Rings is just magnificent. And Howard Shore, who's the composer, plays the Fellowship theme when they set out from Rivendell in all of its major chords, in all of its glory. And then every time you hear the Fellowship theme after that, it ends on a minor note because the Fellowship has been
Mm.
separated. And so even in the soundtrack, you could tell this was the high point of the Fellowship, and then it gets broken apart until the very end of the movie when it comes back together. And what's interesting about this is the fellowship breaks pretty early on in the quest. And this is what happens in Tolkien's life as well. Because the big looming event after he graduates, and there's a great scene at the beginning of John Garth's book where they're all back at King Edward's School as alumni for the alumni student rugby game and the
Right.
oratory competition and the debate that they have. And all of these four and their other friends from the TCDS are there together. They've graduated, they've gone on to Oxford and Cambridge. But Tolkien would reflect later in the preface of the Lord of the Rings, just a few years later, really 3 years from when they gathered together at King Edward's,
Right.
by 1918, all but one of my close friends were dead. Because in 1916, Tolkien marries Edith, and shortly after he leaves for France because World War I had broken out. And that's where we'll pick up in the next episode on J.R.R. Tolkien on the So We Speak podcast.